Funding for this program has been made possible through generous donations by Milken Institute School of Public Health at the George Washington University and Ascend at the Aspen Institute.
This is a story about erasure of people, of culture, of land and place and home, of opportunity and choice, of the bonds that connect us. May we see the truth and reconcile to heal our communities. Cincinnati sits at a geographic crossroads. Depending upon your perspective, some consider it the northernmost city of the South or the southernmost city of the Midwest. When Ohio was admitted as a state in 1803, Cincinnati was an outpost that was both a portal to the West and an important gateway between the North and South. A nod to its location on the western edge of an expanding nation, the city became known as the Queen City of the West. The geographic location of Cincinnati has very much influenced its culture, politics, and race relations. Officially chartered as a city in 1819, by 1829, 10% of the city's population was of African descent, but not all of those who lived in the city's black settlements were born free.
Down here on the banks was the convergence of 3 black original settlements that were right here in Cincinnati. You had Bucktown, Little Bucktown, and Little Africa. All 3 respective communities led all the way up to the banks of the Ohio River.
Being just across the river from Kentucky, Cincinnati attracted abolitionists who used the city as a hub to disseminate anti-slavery publications such as Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Stowe was part of an abolitionist network that designed and operated an intricate system of planned stations along the Underground Railroad. The city's black settlements provided cover for freedom seekers as they aimed to evade bounty hunters who patrolled the city's waterfront. The struggle for freedom for enslaved people spawned the abolitionist movement, with a number of enclaves in Indiana and Ohio providing safe haven while they journeyed north to Canada. Just north of Cincinnati, the village of Glendale was an important station on this network. Glendale native Bill Parrish has written a book called An Underground Community: How Blacks Settled in the Historic Village of Glendale, detailing the village's role in liberating freedom seekers.
I just focus on Glendale.
The courageous quest for freedom included crossing the Ohio River, sometimes hiding in plain sight in Cincinnati's black settlements before being ferried along canal systems. From the canals, freedom seekers used a series of tunnels to be fed, sheltered, and educated out of sight. The level of coordination, planning, and engineering to move people northward is a testament to courage and humanity.
This was planned, it was funded. So as they came through Glendale, we had tunnels under the village, part of the planning of it. We have the train station right here, the train was a part of it. And then just the other side of Sharon, right here, we have the Erie Canal. So we had 3 means coming through the village that you could move slaves north.
While a number of those tunnels have been closed up by village leaders, some of them still exist on private property. Bill took us on a tour around the village to illustrate just how the network was engineered and operated in plain sight.
The tunnels are really well disguised between the houses.
The sound of the train's whistle was the signal for freedom seekers to emerge from the intricate network of tunnels and continue their journey north. While many of the tunnels are on private property and inaccessible to the public, evidence of their existence is visible by the various unnatural mounds and ground formations that can be seen just driving around town.
This house right here is really significant. You can tell, you can look and see how it sits and how the land is and how some of that is how it runs down.
Okay.
So there's a house called the Pillars, and it's significant because of the tunnel that ran from there to here. It was well planned out, strategy, amazing strategy that people got, both black and white, to carry it out. And to see it is like genius. I'm like, this is the best teamwork.
It is estimated that 40,000 freedom seekers crossed the Ohio River in the early 1800s through 1850. Pinpointing exactly how many people crossed through Glendale and other stations along the Underground Railroad may be lost to history due to the risky nature of the deed.
There are some records that you're able to piece together. William Steele in Philadelphia, he used to keep copious notes and records of the people he assisted. After 1865, after the end of the Civil War, he was concerned about being prosecuted for his activity. So he destroyed a good number of his records.
Not all freedom seekers left. Some stayed on as domestic help to many families who operated as conductors and co-conspirators of the Underground Railroad.
Glendale was a really early railroad suburb where people were far away from the city. And so it was even more important that they had a servant class close at hand. And there was always a small black enclave in Glendale.
Long after the Civil War, black families continued to settle in Glendale, a legacy that is still present today. As we were shooting this documentary, a years-long battle to preserve an important site in the history of abolitionists and African Americans in Glendale was finally resolved. An initiative led by the Cincinnati Preservation Association will save this site from the wrecking ball. Built in 1885, the Eckstein School was the first school dedicated to educating Glendale's black community. Preserving the Eckstein School and the legacy of the abolitionists is more than a battle over brick and mortars. It's about narrative.
That's how I felt in the struggle for Eckstein School. It wasn't really about the building ultimately, it was about the contributions that had been made, and I could see those being squashed. So if that happens, doesn't matter what happens with the building, because now you don't have tools to educate people to come to their own conclusions and then have a voice.
In 2022, the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center intends to install markers for visitors to take self-guided tours of Glendale stations that once sheltered those seeking to escape slavery. The battle over preserving both the Eckstein School and celebrating the Freedom Trail highlight the issue of confronting America's truth and whose story gets told. Sites like these in Glendale help to tell a difficult but important part of American history, a history that has often been erased, diminished, or ignored. Only 2% of the 95,000 sites on the National Register focus on African Americans.
Clearly, it's not succeeding in telling all the history of the United States. And a lot of that has to do with the way the National Register was framed at the very beginning. So because we've always decided what was important in American history was mostly white men's history, those African American states don't get included there.
The village of Glendale is an example of the many hidden histories of the Cincinnati region that highlight the truth of systemic racism as well as the courageous efforts to seek justice. And while slavery was never practiced in Ohio, one of the state's first legislative acts, the Black Codes, established a two-tier system of justice that had long-standing effects which are measurable today.
The first piece of Ohio legislature are the Black Codes of 1804, a different set of standards, a different set of rules for people of African descent living throughout the entire state of Ohio.
Differential legal treatment on the basis of race was not a new phenomenon in 1804. The practice was set in motion more than a century prior, following Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia. In 1676, a group of white and black indentured servants and enslaved black people united with a wealthy white Virginia landowner in his battle against another white landowner. The result? The colonial outpost of Jamestown, Virginia, was burned to the ground. Shaken by the prospect of white servants and black enslaved people coming together in protest, lawmakers took action to prevent servants and the enslaved from ever threatening the land-owning class again. The result? legal measures that created social hierarchies, forbid interracial marriage, socializing, and limited rights of the enslaved and free blacks. As a trade-off, indentured white servants were given additional rights. And so, in response to a challenge to white power, the hierarchy of race was codified in colonial law, setting the precedent for race-based legal statutes in the U.S. A hierarchy not based in biology, a hierarchy designed to ensure white power and justify legal subjugation and economic segregation of Black people.
When you really take a look at the Black Codes of 1804, and then you see the Ohio Black Act of 1807, you start to see that there is this parallel of understanding and ideology that is connected to what we call the Jim Crow laws and the Jim Crow era. Social legislation based along racial lines. And that occurred not in the Deep South, not below the Ohio River, but right here above the Ohio River in the north in the state of Ohio.
A process of truth and reconciliation isn't just telling the truth and bleeding the truth and crying over the truth. It is actually helping us to understand that which must be repaired and how we move forward and how all of us have a role in that. And the reconciliation process is accepting those truths, not running from them, accepting the pain, but also accepting and realizing the promise of moving forward. In our work at the Center for Community Resilience, we collaborate with communities across the country to understand the root cause of inequity and adversity experienced by children and families. Communities have shared with us their traumas and the systemic barriers they face in achieving health, well-being, and prosperity. In these partnerships, we've learned that we can't achieve community resilience if we don't address the inequities that generate community trauma. The Pair of Aces tree helps us understand not only what adversity and trauma look like, the leaves and the branches, but it also highlights what is planted in our soil. On these branches and leaves are depicted the 10 classic adverse childhood experiences: physical and emotional neglect, divorce, mental illness, parental incarceration, homelessness, domestic violence, substance abuse, emotional and sexual abuse, and maternal depression. It's estimated that 1/3 of Cincinnati's children experience 2 or more ACEs. In communities of color such as Avondale, that number is estimated to be much higher and include events such as poverty, discrimination, community disruption, lack of opportunity, lack of access to economic mobility and social capital, poor housing quality and affordability, and violence. Although racism was not included as an original ACE, science indicates the experience of racism has a traumatic effect on young people and adults alike. According to Cradle Cincinnati, a coalition of community health workers, social workers, and healthcare providers focused on improving maternal and infant outcomes, nearly 100 Black babies die annually in Hamilton County due to complications from preterm delivery. Cradle Cincinnati applies a focus on Black babies born to Black mothers because here in the city of Cincinnati and across the country, infants born to Black mothers are more than twice as likely to die before their first birthday due to the experience of racism. We know from the science of adverse childhood experiences that exposure to emotional, physical, and psychological stresses earlier in life can have long-term consequences for mental and physical health. If stress can be transmitted from mother to child, imagine how enduring the stress of racism over centuries has changed DNA of generations of families of color.
The racism can actually affect diabetes and heart disease. Like who would have known? Especially because we had been told all this time really that, well, African Americans, you guys just eat a lot of fats and cholesterol and you don't work out and that's why you're sick, which I think some of that may apply, but the fact of the matter is that there's something else going on there too.
That something else is the experience of racism, discrimination, and subjugation endured over generations. The evidence is clear. Adversity endured over generations produces higher susceptibility to health and mental disorders due to the intergenerational transmission of stress.
I really think it's powerful once people can make the connection that if we live in an unjust society, if kids and families grow up in communities where there is no justice and where there is therefore more stress. We know racism, poverty can be huge causes of stress and toxic stress that affects development and childhood well-being.
There is perhaps no clearer way to understand the cumulative impact of stress and disparity than by comparing life expectancy differences across neighborhoods in Cincinnati. The average life expectancy in Cincinnati is 76 years, but when you zoom into neighborhoods, that average can vary widely, a gradient that follows closely with poverty, race, and education. In short, neighborhoods with lower income, lower educational attainment levels, and higher concentrations of people of color have shorter lifespans. For instance, we measure a nearly 10-year difference between Cincinnati's largest predominantly Black neighborhood, Avondale, and neighboring North Avondale, where the population is more than 50% white and more highly educated.
There is a 20 life year difference between different communities here. And so as we're talking about chronic diseases such as cancer, hypertension, diabetes, things of that nature, it's causing a larger impact on our Black neighborhoods and making it so that we're not living as long as other neighborhoods in Cincinnati.
Cradle Cincinnati and efforts from Cincinnati Children's Hospital have focused on Black maternal and child health because of the dire impact that systemic racism and disparity has had on mortality and well-being. In Avondale, the infant mortality rate is more than 3 times the national average. It's not about access to care. Cincinnati Children's Hospital is right in the neighborhood. As many advocates and researchers note, there are larger systemic issues that contribute to both maternal and infant mortality in Avondale, and it impacts Black women across the city.
There was a recent study that was released about U.S. cities, and Cincinnati was at the top or one of the worst cities for Black women, in the sense that Black women in Cincinnati don't live as long. So literally living in Cincinnati as a Black woman can take years off of your life.
All children, no matter their race or zip code, need a safe and stable environment to thrive. This means that their caregiver needs access to housing, employment, and a community that provides supports that promote health and well-being. And yet, for far too many Black women in Cincinnati, these basics are out of reach.
Not making enough money so that you could afford housing, access to quality foods, educational attainment. Like, we know that these are the inequities that exist, and we know that even within communities that are experiencing inequities, that Black women are the ones that are seeing the greatest disparity.
A 2021 study by the Women's Fund of the Greater Cincinnati Foundation found that 49% of all working Black women in Cincinnati make less than $15 an hour, compared with 27% of white women and 24% of all working women in the region. Even with higher educational attainment, Black women have a steeper hill to climb for economic mobility in the Greater Cincinnati region. The same study found that 32% of Black women with a bachelor's degree make less than $15 an hour, compared to 13% of white women, 10% of Black men, and 11% of white men. Clearly, Cincinnati's economy is leaving Black women and consequently their children behind. This bitter but necessary truth points to a larger issue of systemic factors rooted in historical racism. Here in Ohio, just as we have seen across the nation, there has been a movement by conservative lawmakers to block education that helps us understand systemic racism in its entirety. Education that tells the story of what has been endured and what continues to drive disparate outcomes in communities of color, a battle over our truth.
Truth, or two different ways that we can think about truth. Truth with a capital T, right? Facts that we know, things that have definitely happened in history, in our world, that we cannot dispute, right? And then there are small T truths, right? My lived experience. You can't tell me that my lived experience is not my truth. This is pushback against events and historical things, historical facts that we know actually happened, but we don't want to talk about them in an honest way. We don't want to talk about them in their proper context. We don't want to talk about them in an inclusive way, and we don't want to talk about them in a way where we are clearly articulating who is impacted and who continues to be impacted by that capital T truth. And that, for me, is what's so troubling about what we're seeing now in our society and in our political world.
Instead of silencing the voices of truth, efforts by the Ohio State Legislature have only reinforced the determination of partners in the city's Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Coalition to push forward in their efforts to disrupt cycles of systemic racism. In addition to airing the truth with a capital T, the coalition of partners are providing space for healing.
And I really feel like racial healing is a foundational way to begin to shift, to transform the way we think about management, the way we make decisions, public decisions, organizational decisions, the way we create public policy. I would love to hold a racial healing circle with the sponsors of, some of these bills that are being created, right? So we can have conversations so that we can really understand in a very ingrained way how these public policies can operate to further marginalize, to exacerbate the disparities that already exist, particularly for those communities that are most impacted and most vulnerable.
HB 327 is linked to K-12 state institutions of higher education.
The coalition of cross-sector, cross-racial organizations has hosted conversations in community to further dialogue and understanding of the experience of racism in the hopes of creating a pathway to healing and policy change.
Just having the conversation, I think, can feel scary for folks. I think for white folks especially. So having facilitators and methods to have these conversations that are not restrictive to just saying the right thing and doing the right thing were really helpful. So like actually making the quilt squares, having like hands busy and using a different side of the brain somehow opened up this dialogue at tables for people.
Good morning. Good morning. Whoa. Hello.
In the summer of 2020, Learning Through Art, led by Kathy Wade, coordinated the Story Quilts exhibit at the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center, an exhibit curated by Dr. Carolyn Mazlumi in response to the murder of George Floyd in 2020. Quilters from across the country used fabric and stitching to share their pain, fear, hopes, and experiences in the face of American racism.
People ask me all the time, well, why you want to use quilts to tell a story? It's because every human being is familiar with cloth. It's the first thing we're swathed in at birth, and it's the last thing that touches our body upon our death. People equate quilts with hearth and home and safety and security, and it's an easy way to tell a difficult story.
The name of my quilt is Black and Blue. I did it in honor of all the Black police officers who want to do a good job, believe that there's a place for them in the police department.
Bringing the exhibit to Cincinnati was part of an effort to spark conversation, understanding, healing, and ultimately build political will for change.
That history of how we have been able to capture and share stories, generational stories of family, of survival, of things that have happened to folks. Quilting allows us to capture and share.
Story Quilts conversations took place across Cincinnati to foster dialogue about this region's history and individuals' experiences. Dialogue, neighbor to neighbor, stranger to stranger, leaving us friends and with a better understanding of each other.
Once we got into the quilt making and people were able to be creative and share their experience in ways that weren't so traditional, I think it really helped open up that dialogue and people to share on a deep level and to listen on a deep level.
Using art as a means to foster dialogue has been a central tactic for the Cincinnati Coalition partners involved in the truth, racial healing, and transformation process. Sitting across the table from your fellow neighbor, hosting community conversations has been a powerful tool in challenging narratives.
I think that there's so many opportunities today to learn about history and to, for some people, see for the first time a different narrative than what they grew up with. That if people would just listen and lower their defenses a little bit, there might be more understanding.
Earlier, we highlighted the battle over the narrative in Glendale. Whose story gets told often shapes our understanding of history and also shapes our willingness to extend compassion, defines deservedness and scorn in public opinion. Our American narrative has been shaped by a belief in manifest destiny, the belief that the expansion of the U.S. across the West and the domination of white people in this country was both divinely directed and the means, any means to achieve this outcome were justified. A narrative crafted to uphold and ensure the belief in white supremacy as an outcome, a difficult truth indeed.
The truth of the matter is that systemically, we have been moved and controlled by the construct of race. Legislation has been made based upon that social construct. Opportunities have been taken from people who are in a certain group or gender because of how they are viewed. That is the truth.
When we sought to tell the story of structural racism in Cincinnati, it was not because the city is an extreme. The policies and practices used to create inequitable racial outcomes in Cincinnati have been used systematically across the country. In this respect, Cincinnati is no different than any other city in the nation. The narrative of Cincinnati's Black neighborhoods can help us understand how housing policy, urban renewal, the courts, policing practice, and the battle over desegregation in public education have left an imprint on our communities that reinforce a cycle of trauma, inequity, and racial disparity. Structural racism relies on a system of hierarchy by race, a system that centers power and privilege with whiteness. How did we get here? In Cincinnati, just as across the country, the racial wealth gap is staggering. On average, white families have 10 times the amount of wealth as a Black family. The result? 55% of Black children in Hamilton County live in poverty. Here in Cincinnati, Black people make up 40% of the city's population, but less than 1/3 own their own homes, compared to 2/3 of white families. A contributing factor? Home ownership. The number one means by which Americans pass on generational wealth has been systematically impossible for many Black families to attain. While Black home ownership rates in Cincinnati nearly doubled between 1950 and 1970, they have plateaued for the last 50 years. Meanwhile, white home ownership has gradually increased over that same time period. As we tell the stories of Cincinnati's Black neighborhoods, even in instances where some Black families were able to buy a home public policies and practice served to undermine the value of that investment, further contributing to the racial wealth gap and intergenerational poverty.
In the United States, white people count on investing in real estate as really their major form of investment. And of course, that form of investment has been restricted and unavailable to African Americans in this country for almost all of this country's history. But it is a sort of a calculus that white people do of like, oh, can I pay for my kids' college education with this house? How much can I leave to my grandkids from this house?
The New Deal Housing Act of 1934 restricted federally backed mortgages to whites-only neighborhoods across the country. In Cincinnati, that meant that unless you were buying in Clifton, Hyde Park, Pleasant Ridge, and other predominantly white neighborhoods, accessing credit to buy a home was nearly impossible for families of color.
Cincinnati's African American community was absolutely constrained by, post-World War II housing policies, the creation of the, home loan insurance and the GI Bill and all the things that meant that white people could move out to the suburbs, white people could buy new houses, and then really what they left behind were the only things that would be available to African Americans, some of whom could buy, but even then on very different terms. You weren't going to get the same great loan rate or even maybe not a bank loan. You would have to do some kind of informal lending.
In the late 1940s and early 1950s, urban renewal and the city's desire to compete with other growing urban centers influenced housing and development policy. Urban renewal is in fact code used by policymakers to identify areas of American cities slated for demolition of structures that typically housed low-income families and rundown, dilapidated public housing. The idea was to replace the overcrowded tenements with single-family homes, parks, schools, and recreation areas designed for white families or those who were deemed deserving poor. Cincinnati's housing advocates made clear who were deemed the undeserving poor. Blacks and Appalachian laborers recruited to the area to work low-paying meatpacking and industry line jobs following World War II. Beginning in the mid-1800s, as more of the city's middle and upper-class families moved out of the Basin area, land speculators bought their old homes, divided them into flats, and rented them to the poor. These tenements were overcrowded and unsanitary, with sometimes only one outhouse for an entire building. As late as 1950, nearly 30% of homes in Cincinnati had no bath or shower, and 17% did not have a private bath. In short, many homes in the Basin area where the city's poorest residents lived had no indoor plumbing. In Cincinnati's 1948 master planning document, Urban Renewal of the West End detailed removal of 25,000 people from low-income families for the construction of an interstate and warehouses and shipping centers for the likes of industry giants such as Procter & Gamble.
The city had promised that folks displaced from the West End would be rehoused. In 1956, the city had sent a letter to everyone whose house was slated for demolition that said, don't worry, we will put you up in new apartment buildings. You'll have modern amenities, which was exciting because, many of these 19th century buildings, both in the West End and in over the Rhine, didn't have indoor plumbing, or they had the privy was still in the backyard, the flush toilet, but it was still out in the backyard. That letter came just days before an election where Cincinnati's voters were going to be asked to vote for a tax levy to pay for Cincinnati's portion of the cost of the urban renewal project. So they sent this reassuring letter in 1956 to say, don't worry, we've got your back. We will make sure that you have a new house. And then, unfortunately, those promises were never met.
The city reassured Black families of West End they would receive new modern housing in the process of renewal. But political opposition proved difficult, if not impossible, to overcome. Despite passage of a $2.3 million bond to support West End housing redevelopment, promises to the Black community were quickly broken.
The housing authority in Cincinnati had such a hard time finding neighborhoods where they could build a new modern project for African American people. The neighborhood would not allow it, that they eventually decided that the only path they had was to build new housing, let whites move into the new housing, and then let African American people move into the 19th century housing or whatever that the white people had left behind. So there was lots of efforts to integrate those projects or to build projects for African Americans. So for example, the very earliest real public housing we had in Cincinnati was Laurel Homes in Lincoln Court. Originally, that was supposed to be integrated housing. It was money that came from the federal government that was supposed to create integrated housing. But again, Cincinnatians were so outraged by the idea that it would be integrated that the ultimate design was 2 projects divided by Ezra Charles Drive, one for African Americans and one for whites, that were separated by a big multi-lane street.
Black families dispersed across the Cincinnati area. Some found haven just north of the city limits, the state's first incorporated Black city, Lincoln Heights.
A historical African American community that has been truly decimated by social injustice. I tell everybody that you want to talk about the microcosm of the African American experience, you just walk into exit 13 off of I-75 in the middle of Lincoln Heights, you get the whole microcosm from its inception to where we are now.
Incorporated in 1947, Lincoln Heights was the first self-governed Black community north of the Mason-Dixon line. Residents first began the process of incorporation in 1939, but were immediately met with opposition by neighboring white communities. Incorporation of Lincoln Heights would have created the ability to collect revenue from taxes on property and businesses to support the development of public services, basic services that were available to their neighbors in Woodlawn, Lockland, and Evendale. But an incorporated Lincoln Heights meant competition that would draw industry and business from their white neighbors. Nearly 10 years after first petitioning for incorporation, the county finally approved Lincoln Heights' application, but not before dividing up nearly 90% of the city's land to its white neighbors. When all was said and done, Lincoln Heights was reduced to less than 1 square mile.
The shape of Lincoln Heights has this scoop out, right? And if you compare that shape to the map, you'll see that, oh, that's the industrial corridor. That's where all the businesses were. That's where a community would have its tax base, right? And so the potential for Lincoln Heights to earn money as a community, to have income-producing taxable properties was taken away by the surrounding municipalities just chomping up the land that should have been Lincoln Heights.
The fact that you have an African-American community, a historical African-American community, and the scars that are left just by the shape of it, it kind of just talks about the disposability of it, you know what I mean?
What was left for the residents of Lincoln Heights included no major factories, no industrial tax base. Wright Aeronautical wanted to build B-29 bombers on the land that belonged to Lincoln Heights, but the plant's developers objected to operating on land owned by a Black community, so the county gave the land to the new white community, Evendale. Today, that plant continues to operate as part of the sprawling General Electric aviation program.
B&O railroad track, and the railroad track behind GE over there, I think New York Central. I'm not for sure, but it's the railroad track right behind GE. That was supposed to have been Lincoln Heights community. Because you had a whole lot of, over there where GE plant is now, you had a whole lot of Black people living over there too.
From an economic standpoint, the structural violence against Lincoln Heights handed down by county commissioners continues to pay dividends for neighboring Evendale. There, the average household income is nearly $170,000 compared to $34,000 in Lincoln Heights. The system is working just as it was designed for both Evendale and Lincoln Heights, a design built intentionally for differential and disparate outcomes by race, defined by place. For more than 70 years, Cincinnati police have operated a gun range that sits on the northern edge of the city. On the day we visited, gunfire could be heard all over the town, even over the deafening noise of cicadas. The gun range sits adjacent to a public housing complex and a playground.
I'm sending kids out to the playground to hear gunshots. And I would love to ask the question, because I've never been able to get a straight answer. I would love to ask the question of how do you have Cincinnati Metropolitan Housing Authority houses there, which is Mariana Terrace, we call it the projects. Like, how do you have that next to, something else that's owned by the city of Cincinnati?
Pause to consider the reality of the children of Lincoln Heights who have had to digest a steady diet of images of police murdering unarmed Black people across the U.S., while living with the soundtrack of police officers training to use deadly force, day in and day out, right in their backyard.
Just for, posterity's sake, is Cincinnati Police Department, the FBI, the DEA, the ATF, U.S. Marshals, Evendale Police, as well as SWAT, sniper training, all is conducted on the site. So there's roughly, I'm gonna say 38,000 gun training hours per year. They shoot 300 days a year, 6 days a week, 7 hours a day. And again, it's been 74 years, but when we were growing up, it was sun up to sundown. You could hear gunshots at any point.
While the sonic toxicity is obvious, the harm to property values is also a toll. After all, who wants to purchase a home with gunfire as a steady feature of the neighborhood soundtrack? With no industrial tax base, Lincoln Heights struggled to support its own school system. Despite the financial struggles, Lincoln Heights High School produced many athletic and scholarly stars, such as world-renowned poet Nikki Giovanni and Tony Yates, who went on to play in the NBA and become the University of Cincinnati's first African-American men's basketball coach. But integration of public education and financial woes led to the closing of Lincoln Heights High School when it merged with nearby Princeton City Schools.
Growing up in Lincoln Heights, truthfully, we did not know we were poor because everybody shared about the same thing. It was an all-Black school. We had Black teachers, and they stood for no mess, but they were very professional. They came to school teaching in their shirts and ties and suits. The ladies were very elegant, and they wanted nothing but the best for you.
Tell me from an educational standpoint that it got better, I don't know, because we had more folks that went to college when it was Lincoln Heights High School.
And an aching sense of otherness became apparent as a sense of community was lost.
I can remember in English, the teacher said, "I'd like to know what your goals are in high school." And one of my goals was to make the A honor roll. And he kind of laughed. And I thought, that was an incentive to prove to him that I could make an A in English.
In integrated environments, Black students oftentimes face scorn and doubt from students and educators. Bob Johnson, who grew up in Lincoln Heights, and Maxine Yates, who grew up in neighboring Glendale, persevered and thrived in Cincinnati despite the odds. Durance Daniels and Carlton Collins are working to rebuild Lincoln Heights on the dreams of their ancestors and the hopes of today's children.
At the end of the day, you can still persist. You can still progress. You can still build something. Like you could build a legacy.
Now a Lincoln Heights council member, Durance Daniels is taking his grandparents' home here in Lincoln Heights and transforming it into an innovation center, a place where the youth of Lincoln Heights can hone their business skills, create and innovate, and foster vitality for the community.
Everything from a financial standpoint that you'll be able to learn will take place right in this room.
A place to nurture hope. Bishop Ennis Tate is the senior pastor at Avondale's New Beginnings Church of the Living God.
We live in a city where they say there's a need for 40,000 homes for people of low income. And they say we don't have the money, but we have $100 million buildings that we are building every year.
Tate is part of a coalition of Cincinnati ministers working passionately to promote economic equity for Cincinnati's Black neighborhoods.
When you're looking at a tree and it grows, you're looking at the things that it's feeding it, where it's getting its nutrients from the soil, from the water that is being fed into it. A lot of the kids, they don't have the opportunities to get proper nutrients to grow in the way that they should. They don't have the proper structure at home, food, mental health, things to build them mentally, things to build them emotionally. And if they don't have those things, they can't prosper.
Home to the Cincinnati Zoo with the University of Cincinnati and some of the region's best healthcare bordering the community, Avondale should be a prized location for homes, schools, and businesses. Following demolition of homes in the West End, Black families had few options for rental and many flocked to Avondale's large homes and lots. What appeared to be an ideal community quickly changed as realtors preyed on the fears of white homeowners by blockbusting, buying the home of a white family well above the asking price, only to sell it at a loss to a Black family.
There was this transition from model community to a place that was vexed with layers of complicated issues. And so what happens is there's riots in Avondale in '67 and riots in '68.
Between 1967 and 1970, frustration over the city's broken promises to the Black community erupted in a series of riots and firebombings of white businesses along Avondale's business corridor.
Those white businesses chose not to rebuild in Avondale, they just left. And so that Reading Road corridor was largely abandoned, and both the government of Cincinnati and private investment really failed to help put that business district back together.
In the years since, there have been a number of efforts to revitalize the neighborhood's business district. Perhaps the most high-profile investment came in 1983 with the Avondale Town Center development financed in large part by hometown basketball legend Oscar Robertson. Since then, Avondale has the distinction of being the city's largest food desert. A neighborhood of more than 7,000 residents has not had a full-service grocery store since 2008.
We fought for a grocery store now. This is my 10th year talking about a grocery store in Avondale. And just recently, the city committed dollars only because of the redevelopment. So unless there's a place to go for upscale people that are living, we're going to create a grocery store for them, even though this community has been a food desert for more than 10 years. And there was no urgency to put a grocery store in Avondale.
We all have the same needs and wants. Your spoon may be silver, mine may be plastic, but we still want to eat.
Avondale is at the center of Cincinnati's battle over affordable housing. With its prime location, easy access to Interstate 71, minutes from the area's best hospitals, downtown, and the University of Cincinnati, it is a prime target for gentrification. This reality is not lost on community activists who want to improve the community without pushing out current residents.
There is a sense of urgency to uplift the existing community now because we can see on the horizon them being replaced, really pushed out of their homes, and the very projects that we've been told have been brought in to help them end up pushing them out. And so I think there's a sense of urgency to show the city that we're worth it, that we can thrive and that we can heal and really not be pushed out.
With the city's history of broken promises to the Black community, there is good reason for fear that this new push to redevelop Avondale will result in Black families being either pushed out or left behind. Richmond Williams is a self-employed contractor who buys, rehabs, and sells homes here in Avondale.
The housing aspect for me is very key because a lot of residents, they live in deplorable conditions. They live in situations where they live causes ACEs by itself because of the condition of the houses.
Using his own training and remodeling and leveraging his business degree, Richmond works with residents to fix the homes that they will live in, teaching a trade, but also using work as therapy.
Putting the drywall back up, teaching them how to mud, paint. Property is pretty much ready to go. And they've learned a skill that they can take on with them. And the more properties that come, the more people can learn, the more people can get stronger and confident in the things that they're learning. We'd take breaks, I buy them lunch, you know, we'd just sit there and we'd talk at lunch, you know, and it's just that bonding, that taking that time and just listening.
While Richmond is using much of his own savings to finance his effort to revitalize Avondale one home at a time, he has faced systemic barriers to accelerate the pace of his work. As bigger developers begin to eye Avondale for gentrification, Richmond says he has faced financial redlining and accessing credit to buy and rehab more properties.
Some people even told me, Sean, you gotta have a team. You gotta have a white face on your team to go talk to these bankers. And you go to the banks, oh, we got this. We approve of you for this and that, and you do that, you got the credit. Then when they look at the address or the zip code, well, we can only give you $5,000. Like, how can we go from this to this?
Many longtime residents in Avondale wonder if the lack of investment and the response to community violence aren't part of a larger effort to devalue the neighborhood.
Until the city says we're ready to move people out, the policing is minimized. It's almost like we want the value to go down. And so what makes a value go down? Crime, low graduation rates, having more renters than buyers or owners. All of that is designed to take the value of the community down so that when we're ready to build it up, the value of the properties is lower and we can acquire more. So it's strategic, and it's been a part of strategic plans for years.
Many in the Black community are watching with wary eyes as the city makes promises for reinvestment, affordable housing, and fair policing in Avondale. The transformation of nearby Over the Rhine provides a cautionary tale about so-called rebirth from urban decay. After Black families were moved from West End, some moved into neighboring Over the Rhine. There again, white flight led to disinvestment and deplorable housing conditions that lasted well into the early 2000s. In April of 2001, Cincinnati police officers shot and killed an unarmed Black man, 19-year-old Timothy Thomas, in Over the Rhine as he walked to get cigarettes. Thomas was the 15th Black man shot and killed by Cincinnati police officers in the span of 6 years. Thomas's death and the protests led to a collaborative agreement between Cincinnati Police, their union, the ACLU, and Cincinnati Black United Front to implement community policing. In addition to a change in police practice, the shooting of Timothy Thomas also shed light on the inequitable living conditions in Over the Rhine. But instead of improving conditions for those who had been left behind by other renewal efforts in the city, once again, the city's poorest were left behind and pushed out. A dramatic transformation has taken place in the neighborhood in the 2 decades since.
In the last 20 years, Over the Rhine has been gentrified. You know, that buildings have been restored. It's great for the buildings. It's not so great for the longtime residents who lived in those buildings, most of whom were renters. The stories of both the Appalachian heritage that was there and the African American community that was there are not being told.
Erasure and removal. This is the fate that activists in Avondale are working hard to prevent from happening here.
The question is, how do we beautify and bring opportunities into Avondale without pushing people out? And so that's a hard question that I'm not really sure what the answer is.
The things that contribute to strong communities and strong neighborhoods are walkability, so that people are out in the streets, policing their own neighborhoods by just being present, walking their dogs, taking their kids to school. A big part of that is a business district that draws people in. I think strong communities also need transportation systems so that folks can live in those neighborhoods and travel to higher paying jobs other than just being the shop owner or whatever. And then there needs to be some sense of community cohesion. So, social connection and ways for members of the community to know each other, care about each other, take care of each other's children, go to church together, all the things that make you care about your neighbor.
Social connection, good schools, and a strong business district with local owners is how I would describe the neighborhood where I grew up, Cincinnati's Kennedy Heights. Annexed in 1914 as the city's last independent village, Kennedy Heights is situated about 6 miles north of downtown. Many Black families that were able to achieve economic mobility out of the West End and Avondale flocked to Kennedy Heights in the early 1960s, encouraged by the Kennedy Heights Community Council's determination to break patterns of segregated housing. From the outset, the Community Council was determined to foster an integrated neighborhood.
I thought that Kennedy Heights was the ideal community of the whole United States.
We would Christmas carol together. I mean, we had progressive dinners. Everybody would do everything. We never, it wasn't until I really got to probably high school is when I was like, there's some real racism.
Taking lessons from the fears that fueled white flight in other neighborhoods, Kennedy Heights council members chose to organize across racial lines rather than divide.
I think we become too loose with things and we allow other people to influence us when it just shouldn't happen.
Mr. Johnson was one of the neighborhood heroes. His children, some of my first friends. Our bonds were nurtured in play and in the classroom at Kennedy Heights Elementary. I first met Julie and her family in 1977 when I was invited to be a cheerleader for Kensill, a neighborhood sports league founded by Mr. Johnson and a group of Black fathers in 1967. Kensill Athletic Association, which stands for Kennedy Heights and Silverton, provided an opportunity for kids from both neighborhoods to compete in baseball, basketball, and football. Growing up watching a team of Black fathers coach and mentor us as young athletes with the organizational skills of Black mothers who handled fundraising, uniforms, and the chaos of managing the minds and willfulness of children gave us all a sense of community.
A bunch of Black fathers and a few white fathers, we got together and we started this Kensill because at one time, I don't know, we had something like, I believe it was 17 baseball teams, 3 football teams, soccer for the girls, and I don't know how many basketball teams.
While some of the neighborhood went on to professional fame, such as Ken Griffey Jr. and Barry Larkin, others pursued leadership positions in education, policing, and government, including 3 of the Johnson siblings. Scotty Johnson served 33 years as a Cincinnati police officer before being elected as a city council member in 2021. Julie is a retired Cincinnati police officer after serving 21 years on the force. Younger brother Jeffrey and his wife Juanita are educators in Cincinnati public schools, where they focus on the social and emotional needs of students. More than 50 years later, the lessons of leadership, cooperation, and civic responsibility displayed by Mr. Johnson and his wife Shirley provides an example of the possibilities of community cohesion when the environment is rich with supports. At that time in Kennedy Heights, we had 2 neighborhood schools, Kennedy Elementary and Schroeder Junior High.
Community was the foundation. Education was part of community because the teachers, the principals knew that the community cared about the education of the children that were coming in those schools.
Mrs. Roselle.
So it was just a matter of, nothing else was expected.
In Kennedy Heights, the schools were part of a larger ecosystem that made the neighborhood vibrant and fostered social cohesion. Today, an open field sits where Kensill athletes ran the bases as fathers coached batters on the field. There was an outdoor pool where we competed in swim leagues supported by the Cincinnati Recreation Commission, a pool that provided summer jobs to neighborhood kids.
Everybody, after our games, we gathered at Redwood, and all the teams would be together down at Redwood because your coaches would go and buy you a soda after the game, no matter if you won or lost.
In 1980, that social connectedness began to disappear as Cincinnati Public Schools enacted a strategy to close neighborhood schools as part of its integration efforts. More than 30 years after the U.S. Supreme Court banned segregation in public schools, Cincinnati was still struggling with how to integrate in a manner that did not result in white families fleeing the district. This was a huge challenge for a system designed around neighborhood schools in a city where neighborhoods are very segregated.
Cincinnati was stuck where they had to figure out a way to desegregate schools. And the way that they did that was that they created a magnet system so that people would bus their kids by choice rather than resorting to forced busing.
Small neighborhood schools such as Kennedy Elementary, with predominantly Black student enrollment, smaller class size, and an aging facility, became a prime target for closure.
Now the population of school children is shrinking. So they have to consolidate some schools, but they also are trying to figure out how do we racially integrate them at the same time. So really beginning in the 80s and continuing into the 90s, Cincinnati Public Schools closes a lot of school buildings. And there is a huge cost to the neighborhoods that lost those buildings.
A neighborhood institution since 1913, Kennedy Heights Elementary was closed by the district in 1980. A few years later, the neighborhood junior high school Schroeder was also closed, scattering students to other neighborhood and magnet schools across the city. In less than 10 years, the social fabric of the neighborhood was shredded.
Buildings were used to house the Girl Scout troops and the PTA meetings and all the things that when those school buildings are torn down, those things go away.
When you take Kennedy and Schroeder out, it's like children are no longer community oriented because they're going different places.
Yeah.
And they're getting different friends from different areas and stuff like that. And now that community element is gone, that family element is gone.
Cincinnati Recreation Commission then closed the neighborhood pool, and the land was sold to the Kroger Company, which built a superstore on the site.
They had a supermarket, Moxley Supermarket. They had the black pharmacists, Crocker's Drugs, a couple black realtors and whatnot. Those all have disappeared.
The Kroger store put all the little guys out of business, so suddenly the business district is not user-friendly. Those buildings might still be occupied, but they're occupied by real estate brokers or businesses that are not a kind of a walk-in business model, but where you would, a lawyer's office or those kinds of things, professional offices, rather than really the kind of public-facing service uses that a community really needs.
The timing could not have been worse. The loss of the schools and the recreation facilities came at the same time that crack cocaine began to hit the streets of Cincinnati. Youth who may have been engaged in sports, being mentored by neighborhood fathers, were left with fewer constructive opportunities. The Kroger store stayed open long enough to put most of the neighborhood stores out of business, then abruptly shut down. By 1990, the corner of Kennedy Avenue and Montgomery Road, that once held hope and inspiration for a neighborhood, became the site of American blight.
Once the business district becomes uninteresting, or she would call it the great blight of dullness. So once it's dull, that those communities stop being safe because people who want to do bad things recognize, no one's looking, no one's paying attention.
The downward spiral for Kennedy Heights included higher crime, the loss of neighborhood schools, which resulted in a lowering of property values and neighborhood desirability. A devastating blow for many Black families who could trace their history back to the West End, Avondale, and Lincoln Heights. Kennedy Heights had provided a pathway to home ownership and a place for many Black families to join America's middle class. The 1980s was a time when many area manufacturing jobs began to be threatened by trade agreements that took some of the most reliable and high-paying factory jobs overseas. Facing this harsh economic reality, for many, moving out of the neighborhood was not an option.
White people have options. They can live in lots of places. And so when they start to feel like the investment that I have in my home is maybe threatened, they will flee. And that because of structural racism and segregated neighborhoods in Cincinnati, African-American people do not have that choice. So if something in their neighborhood starts to change so that property values decline, there is often no other choice for them but to stay put.
When fundamental elements of a community are ripped out, elements that provide social support, education, and economic independence, what's left is a shell. Throughout this documentary, we have highlighted the importance of housing, education, and jobs as pillars of community resilience. As former police officers, both Julie and Scotty attest that in the absence of these elements, community policing can be an important lifeline, but only if done right.
Honestly, community policing can be one of the assists if it's done right. If people would take the time to get to the root of what really is going on in that community, then you will see some camaraderie. When you take those things out, the schools, and the police are just called to come in when there's an issue, they're not walking the community, there's no relationship there, that's when you start to see the demise.
Scotty and Julie should know. They were both part of the collective agreement enacted by Cincinnati police following the murder of Timothy Thomas. The hope and the promise of bringing back neighborhoods from the brink isn't just about dollars and cents. It's about making sure neighborhoods have the supports and resources needed to foster social connectivity and respect.
And that's the difference. You have to make sure the community is a partner. Not just they are a partner in this, and people have to be willing to accept the community's needs. Because guess what? You work there, you roll in and you roll out. You roll out most of the time and go back to another community. So the community has to be a partner. The community has to be consulted.
One of the big things and one of my most rewarding things in law enforcement was working at the Boys and Girls Club. Every we would go and help kids with their homework. And so we got to know the children. And Avondale was the community and loved it. And the kids loved us. And they when they saw us, or if you did have to show up at their house, they was, oh, that's Miss Julie. She's cool, nothing's. So it was a whole different thing.
Today, Kennedy Heights is on the rebound as new families move in, older homes rehabbed, many of them by new white families. My family and many of my cousins have long since sold their homes, and the Johnson family home has been sold as well. As the demographics of a neighborhood change, one thing remains the same. The lessons learned from what happened to Kennedy Heights, Avondale, Lincoln Heights, and West End can be translated to communities across the country and our nation. The community trauma is real.
In Cincinnati, we have very, very high rates of students who have experienced these kinds of adverse early childhood experiences or childhood experiences, and they manifest sometimes like learning disabilities or children are angry or uncooperative. And so children, particularly children of color who experience a lot of toxic stress or live in environments that are filled with that, are often misinterpreted and labeled.
The cycle of systemic racism that has impacted generations of Black people in Cincinnati warrants our immediate and full attention. When we launched this project, we sought to tell the truth about systemic racism, not merely to air grievances from the past, but rather to highlight policies that resulted in specific and measurable harm, intentionally and reliably to communities of color. We cannot solve that which we do not fully understand. Those who have been harmed deserve to be acknowledged so that we can move forward together with healing and substantive change.
When I think about the West End, for example, there was significant trauma done to Black families who had to give up their homes. The West End had been an African-American neighborhood for 40, 50, 60, 70 years. It was where people's churches were and their schools were and their favorite candy store, and they walked to grandma's house, and all of that being rooted in place suddenly just is obliterated. Has anyone ever apologized for this? And I was like, no. No one has ever said they were sorry to Cincinnati's Black community, right?
We began this process in Cincinnati with conversations, neighbor to neighbor. Speaking truth to one another may be uncomfortable, but is a necessary step to healing and building the resolve for change.
Cincinnati is a microcosm of this country that needs a lot of work, that needs a lot of difficult conversations, that needs a lot of refresh. I'll use the term refresh. But the country as a whole needs a complete refresh. So when you talk about the uncomfortability, like you said, your uncomfortability has not helped people, Black people in this country.
Across the city, we met with lawmakers, community activists, and residents who believe the opportunity for change is now.
I feel Cincinnati is ready. Cincinnati has been ready. We're going through a great infrastructure building, rebuilding. And my strong opinion, I feel once we can get past greed, corruption, anything can happen.
In November 2021, Cincinnati voters elected a new slate of city council members that returned only 3 incumbents on the 9-person slate. Along with the newly elected Mayor Aftab Purval, all of the candidates ran on platforms that highlighted the need for economic mobility for the Black community and the creation of affordable housing, issues that resonate with a coalition of ministers who have been working to spur investments in housing and Black businesses to achieve economic equity for Black Cincinnatians. Pastor Gene Ellington of the Consolation Baptist Church is part of a coalition called the Collective Economic Empowerment Group that works to leverage the collective power within Black churches to fuel economic growth.
We interview and select businesses, and we then patronize those businesses. First year out, we spent over $1 million with those businesses. And now we have 50 businesses where there are 25 churches, 50 businesses, all patronizing those businesses, and we're seeing those businesses grow.
It's not just grassroots efforts in the church. Pastor Ellington's efforts are also in brick and mortar investments that fulfill essential community needs.
We're opening a grocery store in Bond Hill. We're doing affordable housing in Roselawn and other projects.
Building equity in communities harmed by systemic racism will require major investments from the systems that have benefited from inequality.
First 10 years, we want to have Black-owned banking in Cincinnati. We're already well underway in our discussions with Liberty Bank, which is a national bank, opening a branch here. That's being led the way by the CEAI, that group, and CEG. So the Collective Empowerment Group, led by people of color in our city, and the Community Economic Advancement Initiative are working on Black home ownership, Black-owned business, and Black-owned banking.
Fostering equity is a long-term strategy, with many of the tactics already outlined by the coalitions. One strategy includes holding corporations accountable for many of the multi-billion-dollar equity pledges made in the wake of 2020's Summer of Racial Reckoning. As many coalition members we spoke with pointed out, there is opportunity for these corporate giants to make investments right here at home.
So I lead a racial equity coalition working to dismantle racial inequities in 5 priority areas: health, housing, education, economic mobility, and justice, with a goal to uplift or elevate Black women in Hamilton County.
Denisha Porter leads All In Cincinnati, a community-led coalition focused on systemic change. For Porter and others, corporate partners and city leaders have an opportunity to make Cincinnati a national model for fostering equity and building community resilience. They can do so with investments in people and communities that have historically been under-resourced and undervalued.
About 49% of Black women in Hamilton County make $15 or below. And so when we're thinking about addressing economic mobility, it's really something that we need to address from the root. Affordable housing is a really huge issue in Cincinnati, as well as economic mobility, but there's been 2 narratives that have been talked about. And so some narratives state like we don't really have an affordable housing issue, what we have is a wage issue. And some people say we really don't have a wage issue, what we really need is more affordable housing. But really I think it's the intersection between both.
All of the newly elected council members and Mayor-elect Purval ran on platform issues such as affordable housing, economic development, and health equity. Coalition members suggest targeted approaches and bold action is needed now.
Targeted universalism says that you can create policy solutions that strengthen and reduce disparity for the social groups that are most impacted, and also creating policy decisions for people that are not experiencing such extreme disparity as well, right? So you can have targeted approaches with universal benefits.
Small dollar mortgages is one targeted solution that provides a pathway to home ownership in neighborhoods like Avondale and Lincoln Heights. Small dollar mortgages are written for homes that cost less than $100,000 and are a proven strategy to help low-income and middle-income families achieve home ownership. In addition to providing a pathway to generational wealth, there is an immediate dividend for these families. Oftentimes, their monthly mortgage payment is less than what they are currently paying in rent. Increasing the number of home owners in a neighborhood has a demonstrated impact also. As home ownership levels rise and rental rates lower, a neighborhood is stabilized, property values increase, crime rates drop, community and police relations improve, and the area becomes more attractive for other business investment. As we learned in the stories of West End, Avondale, Lincoln Heights, and Kennedy Heights, the linkage between housing, public education, and community safety cannot be ignored. Breaking cycles of systemic racism as demonstrated in the stories of Cincinnati's neighborhoods will take political will, community perseverance, and time. Time to undo the harms repeated over more than 2 centuries here in the Ohio Valley.
I hope that this initiative will inspire people to think more broadly and have the capacity to accept all these other stories and embrace them as their story. That this is a part of the society that we have collectively built. And so what is the future for us? Because a lot of the work that we're doing today, we probably will not see the fruits of our labor, but it will be recorded.
Yes, the actions we take will be recorded in history, a story that our children will tell. In the end, we do this work for our children as the ancestors that we will become. We do this for a legacy of justice. As civil rights icon and Congressman John Lewis said, "If not us, then who? If not now, then when?" What began as a story of erasure has the potential to transform into one of reconciliation, restoration, and ultimately resilience. But we, the people, and those we've elected to serve, must make it happen.
What we want is a place where children feel seen and known and experience a deep sense of belonging. And the only way that we can accomplish that is to equip educators to meet those needs, to understand those children and to value their cultural differences.
We work with lots of educators, and this critical race theory argument drives us all crazy. It has nothing to do with this. These are arguments, these are defense mechanisms that people who are uncomfortable recognizing the truth are using.
And the best advice I was ever given in unpacking privilege and all the different ways we describe like what it means to be white in a racist society is get comfortable being uncomfortable.
So for white Christians, we don't think we have Americanism, white Americanism woven into our gospel. But as soon as somebody sings God Bless America, it's like we want to raise our hands and worship. As if that's to Jesus, and it's not. It's about America. Yeah, we want God to bless America, but how about blessing all people as equals?
The Republican Party has principally ignored us. The Democratic Party has taken us for granted. And so we have to become more educated about the people that we support. for political offices, and not only support them on election day, but to also hold them accountable during the course of their term.
But if no checks are written, and we talk about this again in a year, after those are set up, we have a problem, Cincinnati, and we'll talk about it. The difference is there are enough community leaders in place today to raise accountability.
If we do the same things that we've always done, or if we stick with the status quo, then we're going to get the same results that we've always gotten. And the system's designed to repeat itself, so we're designed to continually be underachieving.
There's a debate about whether or not even having a process of truth and reconciliation is patriotic. There are some that would say speaking of these hard truths actually divide us as a country as opposed to bringing us together. And I am of the thought, and I think you are as well, that there couldn't be anything more patriotic than wanting to actually have this country live up to its promise.
As somebody who has never considered myself much of a patriot, one of the things that I do hold true is the idea of America.
Funding for this program has been made possible through generous donations by Milken Institute School of Public Health at the George Washington University and Ascend at the Aspen Institute.